Are you wondering if God really loves you when you mess up? Is God angry with you? We are going to talk about Psalm 6 today in our Psalms series. So that is next on the Wounds of the Faithful podcast.
Welcome to the Wounds of the Faithful podcast, brought to you by DSW Ministries. Your host is singer, songwriter, speaker, and domestic violence advocate Diana Winkler. She is passionate about helping survivors in the church heal from domestic violence and abuse and trauma. This podcast is not a substitute for professional counseling or qualified medical help. Now, here is Diana.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to the podcast. So glad to have you here with me. If you've been listening to the podcast for any length of time, you might notice something's missing. The ads. Yes, I decided after looking at how much I made in 1 year, having what we call pre-roll ads. So I had 2 ads before the show started every episode. Can you guess how much money I made from a year with a weekly podcast? I made $5. Now, that doesn't cover any expenses at all. I would need to do that for 4 years before I got $20. I don't like ads to begin with. I just thought this would be another way to get some income coming in, but it is not worth it to me to have ads. I don't enjoy them listening to other people's podcasts. I refuse to do mid-roll, having ads in the middle of my show. So I've decided just not to do the ads until they start paying more money. People talk about sponsorship. I really haven't found a sponsor that I would be comfortable endorsing. So if you're one of those people that want to sponsor the podcast, you can do that. Send me a message. Email diana@dswministries.org. If you have a company or a business that you think would be a good fit for the show, then I'd like to hear from you. Letting you know the show is created without AI. I write all of the scripts myself. I do all the editing myself. All of the graphics are designed by hand. The pictures are not retouched in any way. Yeah, I have editing software that can do a lot of things, but I don't use it. I had once sped up the podcast to go a little bit faster, and one of my listeners said it didn't sound right. I'm not going to do that again. I don't see the benefit, but how can you support the podcast? People ask that all the time. Yes, I have music that I produced. It's on my website. I've had people reach out for mentoring. I do mentor abuse survivors. I do concerts for people. We do have Mending the Soul. That is free. I get a lot of requests for that. I already have 4 people on a waiting list for Mending the Soul healing groups. But if you do want to find a group, then I can find somebody that's starting a group now for you. So still reach out to me if you have any needs, how else you can support the podcast. You can join our Facebook group. You can share these episodes. You can comment or like these episodes on YouTube. You all know this. You know how the algorithms work. If nobody comments or likes or shares the episode, it doesn't get seen or heard. So I would really appreciate that from you today. Doesn't cost you any money. You probably know somebody that could benefit from this content. So anyway, some fun things that happened to me this week. We had Peter Franson and his wife Holly over for dinner at our home. If you remember from episode 125, Peter was on the show talking about Christian culture in today's world with movies and video games. And we are both sci-fi geeks, so that was a really fun episode to do. He's a member of my church. He's now an elder at our church, and he's in the worship team. If you haven't heard that episode, it's very enjoyable. A lot of geekery going on. In fact, his podcast is called Christian Geek Central. He brings a lot of value to the conversation on Christian culture. So, yeah, episode 125, check that out. I might have him back on the show with his wife sometime. I think that's it for the announcements. We are doing Psalm 6 today. I've been reading through the Psalms, trying to find the ones that really speak to me so I can share those with you. If you were here last week, we did a lot of introduction to King David, who is the author of probably half the Psalms in the Bible. And so if you haven't listened to the previous episode, please go back and review that. I'm not going to repeat the background stuff too much because I want to talk more about this particular psalm. This one is also written by David. And I had been reading some other psalms this week, but let me just read a couple verses from the previous chapters just because I like them so much. So, like Psalm 4 in verse 1, you have given me relief when I was in distress. I like that. Psalm 5, verse 4, for you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you. You hate all evil doers. You destroy those who speak lies. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man. Verse 10, make them bear their guilt, O God. Verse 11, but let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them ever sing for joy and spread your protection over them. Those that love your name may exalt in you. I really like those verses. You know, the Lord abhors a deceitful man. We deal with a lot of deceit with being survivors. That kind of spoke to me here. So, this psalm, Psalm 6, it is a penitential psalm. What does that mean? Well, that's when they're talking about confession and humility. This particular psalm it's a custom in the Christian church to meditate on this psalm during Ash Wednesday. Now, not all of us are Catholic. I was raised that way, but Ash Wednesday is when they put the ashes on your forehead to make you remember that you came from the dust of the earth. And when you die, your body is going to go back to the dust. Maybe a little bit morbid, but it's kind of preparing for us to go to the other side, to eternity, to heaven. We do have to physically die. This psalm is an all-out plea for grace. So let's start reading some of this. It's only 10 verses, so it will not be very long, but there's lots of meat in here to talk about. I think, okay, where is... Okay, so I'm reading out of the ESV version, and the title here is To the Choir Master with Stringed Instruments, according to the Sheminith, a Psalm of David. So you're thinking, what's a Sheminith? Well, I'm going to read the commentary here in my Bible. It explains that. The term Sheminith appears to be related to the number 8. Common suggestions for its interpretation include the name of a tune, instructions as to the pitch or key in which the song is to be sung, or a reference to a specific type of stringed instrument. For example, one with 8 strings. So that's kind of interesting. So let's read in verse 1. O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are troubled. My soul also is greatly troubled. But you, O Lord, how long? Let me stop there and comment on this. So David believes he is suffering because God is disciplining him. That is his perception. We don't really know the event that goes with this psalm. We think it might be King Saul that was chasing him. It's not 100% clear. Most commentators, scholars believe that he must have committed some sort of a sin, and he is believing that God is angry with him. He wants to be rescued. And we're going to talk about this disciplining and anger. If you are a child of God, God is not angry with you. When we get disciplined by God, that is out of love and not anger. He is angry at the evil that's in this world, the evil people, as we just read in previous chapters. So, chastening is the mark of adoption. We are adopted into God's family when we choose to be a believer in Jesus. So, if you have good parents, your parents disciplined you and you did something wrong, something legitimately wrong, okay? I was definitely disciplined and it was not fun. And we are angry with our parents when they discipline us. We don't enjoy it. If your parents are good people, they don't enjoy it either, disciplining us. But that shows that they love us. They don't want us being juvenile delinquents, growing up to be bums or convicts or just not a very nice person. It's their job to show us the right way, to discipline us in ways that would discourage us from doing that again. Not really going to talk about modes of punishment today, but you parents know your children well. Some children need more discipline or different methods than another child. So God is the same way. God disciplines us. He knows us very well, and he is a fair and just parent. And we went through an entire series on Job. God was not angry with Job. That is not why he suffered. It was somebody else's sin. It was Satan, the enemy of God. So we want to make that very clear that this is just David's perception that God is angry with him. He is languishing. David describing the intensity of the struggle. He has a lot of emotions here. He's very weary. Have you experienced some of these emotions? He mentions, my bones are troubled. I couldn't help but think of, when you get to my age, when the weather changes, I can feel that in my bones. Anybody else like that? I can predict the weather better than the weatherman. And then in verse 3, this is also, spiritually affecting him. My soul is also greatly troubled, not just my body. In this last phrase in verse 3 says, but you, O Lord, how long? That is a very common phrase or statement in the Psalms is, how long? How long am I going to suffer, God? When am I going to get some relief? And that is lamenting. We have several books in the Bible that talk about that you are so sad. You have Lamentations, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, many saints who languished in pain. And they always ask that question as well. How long am I going to have to deal with this? So let's go on to verse 4. Turn, O Lord, deliver my life. Save me for the sake of your steadfast love. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise? Okay, so David acknowledges that God has a lot of steadfast love. Don't deliver my life because of me, not for my righteousness, but yours, your steadfast love. So, what is Sheol in verse 5? Sheol, Sheol, that is another word for the grave. Some people translate that hell, but a literal translation means the grave, when they put you in the ground. And this is not an evidence of no afterlife, so don't confuse this. Don't get the wrong idea. Old Testament saints, their beliefs were a little murky about the afterlife because this is before Jesus died on the cross. The New Testament is very clear about knowing about our afterlife, where you're going to spend eternity. The Old Testament saints believed that you wait in the grave until the Messiah came, and then you would go to heaven with God. I will say David really wasn't sure what would happen when he died. And they did not have the resources that we have. They don't have the completed Bible in their hands. They have not seen the Messiah yet. They are waiting for him. So let's go to another comment for this particular verse 5 is a dead body doesn't worship or praise you, God. So save me, because if I die, I won't be praising you or worshiping you. So let's go on to verse 6 and 7. I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with weeping. My eye wastes away because of grief. It grows weak because of all of my foes. So this language is very poetical. So we would call this a poetic exaggeration. Flooding his bed with tears. Your eyeball's going to fall out of your skull because of grief. He's hounded by his enemies. And the question I've always had is, why does God love David so much? As we talked about last week, he's obviously not a perfect person. He's a flawed man. I read in one commentary that David comes to the table without a lot of pride, puffery, presence about him. He only has humility to offer, no matter how flawed he is. But God saw that his heart was good. So, in other words, a passionate heart impresses God. Not so much how many works you do, how much you go to church, how much you give to the church, how much you volunteered the soup kitchen, how many hours do you read your Bible. God isn't so much impressed with that as much as your heart, that you really want to know God, you want to please him. When you have sinned against God, then you come to him for forgiveness. When you have that justifiable guilt after you've done something legitimately wrong, that feeling in there is given to you by God to motivate you to seek him out and get things right with him, not to run away from him. God always has mercy for us. And that's a lot of people think that if you've made some really horrible mistakes, then it's over for you. And that's why I like going through some of these Bible stories, character studies of the saints in the Bible, to show you that they were far from perfect. They've done some horrible things. I mean, I've never killed anybody. And so I kind of, get that false sense of righteousness. Well, I've never killed anybody. I've never stolen from somebody. I never beat anybody up, whatever. But if God's examining my heart, he can point out some things that I have done, which I won't get into because I've done it on previous podcasts. But God kind of points out some things in my mind. You thought you were better than everybody else. We are all sinners, and we all need God's grace and forgiveness. We just have to ask him for it. Just come and ask him for it. And I think that getting it off your chest is therapeutic. Coming to the Lord and praying to him. And prayer is just talking with God, just like I'm talking to you, just like you're talking to a friend or a family member. Getting it off your chest really helps with that burden. If you haven't seared your conscience, you have a basic knowledge of right and wrong, you feel bad when you do something wrong. So here, tears are like liquid prayers. There's a verse in scripture. I need to look it up because I'm going to really bash it. Romans 8:26. Which I should have remembered that because that's my favorite book in the Bible. Let me read it for you because it goes along with this. So it says, likewise, the Spirit also helps our infirmities, for we know not what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit itself makes intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. And in the same way, the Spirit also helps our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. You ever try and pray and you have no idea what to pray? You have no strength to pray. You don't know what to say. You're just so distraught. And that's what has happened here. So when I say liquid prayers, that is kind of how I would describe this. The Holy Spirit the third member of the Trinity. He will take our tears and our heart and our feelings and kind of translate that into a prayer for us. It's hard to describe our emotions, hard to put them in words sometimes to God. Or when somebody calls on you to pray in church or in Bible study, it's like, oh, what should I say? When you don't have the words, it's okay to just cry before the Lord. You can still reach out to God. He knows your heart and he's listening. David knows that God is the one who listens, who hears, and who will act on his behalf. So this is the end of the Psalm, verse 8 through 10. Depart from me, all you workers of evil, for the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. The Lord has heard my plea. The Lord accepts my prayer. All of my enemies shall be ashamed and greatly troubled, and they shall turn back and be put to shame in a moment. So he said his prayers, and the Lord gave him assurance that he was heard and that his enemies would be taken care of. So he's celebrating a renewed confidence in God by warning his enemies to flee. So that's pretty deep. Sending out a warning to those that are beating him up. Hey, God's heard me. He's on my side now. So you guys better watch out. I like the last part of this. My enemies shall be ashamed and greatly troubled. They shall turn back and be put to shame in a moment. Yes, the tables will be turned on you. So that is the end of Psalm 6. I thought this was a good one to go process. If there's a psalm that you would like me to do on the podcast, let me know. There's so many really good ones. I'll be looking this week for another one that I think will be a blessing for you to help you have hope in the Lord, have trust in Him through the tough times this week. So I am trying to practice what I preach. And so I think reading the Psalms at this time will also be very therapeutic for me. And you and I can both relate together and get some blessings and healing. So I hope that you have a great week. God bless you. And we will see you next week on the podcast. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Wounds of the Faithful podcast. If this episode has been helpful to you, please hit the subscribe button and tell a friend. You can connect with us at dswministries.org, where you'll find our blog along with our Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube channel links. Hope to see you next week.